The courtroom was filled with the usual murmur of anticipation. The judge, a man who had seen hundreds of cases in his long career, sat confidently at his desk, eyes focused on the file before him. It was a simple case, really, a small offense committed by a man who had apparently made a mistake. The judge had dealt with far worse in his time, and today, he was certain, would be no different. The black man stood at the front of the courtroom, his expression calm but intense. The judge couldn't quite place it, but there was something in his eyes that seemed out of place, something that didn't match the usual nervousness of a defendant. Perhaps it was just his imagination, but the man's demeanor hinted at a knowledge the judge didn't yet understand. The judge cleared his throat and glanced over at the prosecutor, then back at the defendant. "You stand accused of a minor offense," he began, his voice firm, the weight of his years in the courtroom evident in every word. "This case will be treated as any other, and I will issue a fair ruling." He didn't give the man a second thought, assuming that it would be a quick decision. After all, there was no real dispute. The black man shifted slightly, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating almost. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of something more, a quiet strength. "I'm not here to dispute my offense. I'm here to make sure you understand who I truly am." The judge paused, his brow furrowing slightly. This wasn't typical. Most defendants were focused on defending themselves, but this man seemed to be speaking from a place of calm, almost like he had no fear of the consequences. "You've already admitted your guilt," the judge replied, his tone a bit sharper now, annoyed at the disruption. "There's no need for theatrics. Let's proceed." The man's expression softened, but there was a glint of something in his eyes, something that made the judge uneasy. "You don't know who I am, do you, Judge?" he asked, his voice quiet, but each word carrying weight. The judge frowned, unsure of where this was going. "What are you implying?" he asked, a touch of impatience creeping into his voice. He was not a man to be intimidated. The man stood a little taller, his calm demeanor unchanged. "I am not just any man. I am someone who has spent years fighting for justice. I have held positions of power in the very system you've built your career upon." The judge's mind raced. What was this man saying? He couldn't be serious. No one had ever walked into his courtroom and spoken like this. This was just another petty criminal, wasn't it? But before the judge could respond, the man added, "I'm a federal prosecutor. I've worked on cases that have shaped the legal landscape of this country." The words hit the judge like a slap. The courtroom seemed to freeze in place, the words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. The black man wasn't just some average defendant, he was someone with the power to bring down the system that the judge had spent his life defending. The judge's heart raced. He tried to regain his composure, but his mind was spinning. "You're a federal prosecutor?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and suspicion. "And you've been standing before me, facing the same consequences as any other defendant?" The man nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. And I am here to show you that justice is not just about following the law, it's about understanding who is truly in front of you." The judge's hand hovered over his gavel. This was no ordinary case anymore. This wasn't about a simple infraction, it was about a revelation that would force him to confront everything he thought he knew about the legal system. Everything was about to change. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge sat back, stunned. The man had just flipped the script in a way no one, not even the judge, could have predicted. The courtroom was still, with every eye fixed on the man standing at the front. The revelation that he was a federal prosecutor had shaken the judge to his core. The judge, once so confident in his authority, now found himself grappling with something far beyond his understanding. Who was this man, really? And how had he found himself in this position? The black man stood tall, calm as ever, but there was an air of quiet determination about him. He had known this moment would come. He had prepared himself for it, not with arrogance, but with a deep sense of justice and resolve. He wasn't just there to explain himself, he was there to teach the judge something the judge had clearly never considered. "You don't understand, do you, Judge?" the man spoke again, his voice steady but piercing. "You look at me, and you see just another criminal. You see someone who doesn't belong in your courtroom. But you're wrong. I've spent years fighting for justice in this country, working on cases where lives were at stake. I've put away people who thought they were above the law. I've fought for the powerless. And yet here I am, standing before you, treated as nothing more than a defendant with a minor infraction. Why?" The judge opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. What could he say? His mind was a whirlwind of confusion. He had seen hundreds of criminals come through his courtroom, but this man, this prosecutor, was different. The man's words were beginning to chip away at the assumptions the judge had built his career on. The judge had always seen the law as an impartial entity, with clear rules and consequences. He had believed that justice was simple, people broke the law, and they paid the price. But now, in front of him, was evidence that it wasn't that simple at all. The man's gaze never wavered as he continued, "I've seen the flaws in this system, Judge. I've seen how people like me, people with power, with influence, can make a difference. But I've also seen how the system fails those who don't have that power. It fails people like me, people who should be given the respect they've earned, not just based on their job title, but on their humanity. But you," he paused, a slight shake of his head, "you see only what you want to see." The judge's face flushed. He could feel the weight of the man's words, each one like a hammer striking the foundation of his beliefs. Could it be true? Had he really been so blind? All these years of decisions, of judgments, and never once had he questioned whether he was truly serving justice, or simply reinforcing his own biases. But the man wasn't done. He took a step forward, his voice calm but filled with the weight of years of experience. "I am here not because I deserve to be punished, but because you, Judge, need to understand that your decisions have consequences. You sit there with your gavel, your robes, believing that you are the one who hands out justice. But what if the truth is that you, like so many others, are part of the problem?" The judge felt a surge of anger rise within him, but it was quickly tempered by a cold fear of realizing that this man was right. He had spent his career seeing himself as a guardian of justice, but now, he was forced to question the very system he had long believed in. The man's voice softened, almost as if he were speaking to an old friend. "I'm not here to destroy you, Judge. I'm here to show you that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about understanding. It's about seeing people for who they truly are, not just for their offenses or their station in life." For a moment, the judge couldn't speak. The words had hit him harder than anything he'd experienced in his years of presiding over cases. The judge had always thought that he held the power in the courtroom, that he was the one who could control the outcome of a person's life. But now, for the first time, he realized how little he truly understood. The black man paused, giving the judge a moment to digest the weight of what he was saying. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier, the weight of truth bearing down on them both. The audience, once quiet, now seemed to lean in, almost as if they too were waiting for the judge's reaction. "Judge," the man said softly, almost as if he were offering the judge a lifeline, "I'm not your enemy. I'm here to show you that there is more to justice than simply passing judgment. If you're willing to look past your biases, if you're willing to hear me out, maybe you'll see what I mean." The judge sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He wasn't sure what to think anymore. Was this a test? Or was this a man who had truly come to change the way he saw the world? The weight of the moment was unbearable. The judge had to make a choice. Would he remain steadfast in his own beliefs, or would he open his mind to the possibility that he, too, had been wrong? The man had given him something to think about, a new way of seeing the world, a new way of understanding what justice really meant. And for the first time in his life, the judge wasn't sure where this path would lead him. The courtroom had fallen into an uneasy silence. Judge Richardson could feel the weight of the man's words still hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. His hands rested on the wooden desk, but his mind was no longer focused on the case at hand. Instead, it was reeling with the implications of everything the black man had said. He had spent his entire life in the courtroom, sure of his authority, sure of the fairness of the system. Yet now, for the first time, doubt crept in. He had always believed that his role as a judge was simple: to uphold the law, to mete out justice according to the letter of the law. But the man's words had shaken him, planting a seed of doubt that now threatened to grow into something far more complicated. Could it be that his entire career had been based on assumptions? Could it be that the justice he thought he was dispensing had been tainted by his own biases? The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but the man's voice echoed in his mind, challenging him at every turn. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about understanding. How many people had he sentenced, simply based on their appearance, their background, their social status, without truly understanding who they were or what they had endured? How many times had he handed down judgments without considering the nuances, the context, the human experience behind the case? "Your Honor," the man said, his voice cutting through the judge's thoughts, "you don't need to make a decision now. But I ask you to think about what I've said. Think about what it means to truly serve justice." The judge's heart raced. He was supposed to be in control here. He was supposed to be the one who decided what was right and wrong. Yet, in this moment, he realized that he wasn't the one with the answers. He was just a man, and like every other person in the courtroom, he carried his own prejudices and limitations. He looked at the man standing before him, his expression unchanged, calm, almost serene. How could someone who had spent his life in such a powerful position, fighting the very system that had now brought him to this courtroom, remain so calm? And why, despite everything, did the judge feel the weight of his guilt more than ever? The judge glanced around the courtroom. He saw the faces of the audience, many of whom had likely faced the same biases and prejudices the black man had spoken about. The realization hit him harder than any of the cases he had ever ruled on. The justice system wasn't fair. Not for everyone. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had been a part of the problem all along. He felt a pang of shame in his chest. He had been blind. Blind to the ways that power, privilege, and bias shaped his decisions. The realization that he had been reinforcing a system of injustice, even unintentionally, made him question everything he had believed in. For the first time in his career, Judge Richardson felt the weight of the robe he wore, not as a symbol of authority, but as a symbol of the power that had been entrusted to him, and the responsibility that came with it. The gavel wasn't just a tool for handing down sentences, it was a reminder that his decisions had far-reaching consequences, not just for the people who stood before him, but for the entire system he represented. The man, sensing the judge's internal struggle, spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I'm not asking you to change your decision today, Judge. I'm asking you to think differently. To see me for who I am, not just as a defendant in your courtroom, but as a man who has lived and fought for justice, just like you. I'm asking you to look beyond the offense, to look at the person standing before you. Can you do that?" Judge Richardson took a deep breath. He didn't know what to say. His mind was still racing, caught between his duty as a judge and his growing understanding that the system he had spent his life defending was not as just as he had believed. The tension in the room was palpable, and for the first time, the judge felt the full weight of his power. He could continue down the path he had always followed, make his ruling based on the letter of the law and his own assumptions, or he could take a step back, challenge his own beliefs, and consider what it truly meant to serve justice. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The judge could feel the eyes of everyone on him. They were waiting for his decision, but it wasn't just the decision about this man's case that weighed on him. It was the decision about who he would be from this moment forward. Would he continue to be the man who handed down decisions without question, or would he be the man who embraced the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be? The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick with emotion. For the first time in years, the judge felt small. He wasn't sure of his next move. But there was something inside him, something he hadn't felt before, uncertainty. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward real change. Judge Richardson had never been one to back down from a challenge. He had spent his entire career making tough decisions, passing judgment on cases that many would never fully understand. But this case, this moment, was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It wasn't just a matter of right or wrong anymore, it was about something much deeper, something that touched the very core of what justice truly meant. The courtroom felt different now. The air was thick with tension, the space between the judge and the black man palpable. Judge Richardson sat at the bench, gripping his gavel, the weight of it feeling heavier than ever before. His mind was a battlefield, torn between the man's words and the professional duty he had lived by for decades. He had always seen the law as absolute, something that must be followed to maintain order. But now, he wasn't so sure. "I've heard you, Mr. Edwards," the judge said, his voice quieter than usual, as if he was speaking to himself as much as to the man before him. "But this isn't just about you. This is about the law. And the law says what it says." His words were more for reassurance than conviction, as if he was trying to convince himself that he still held control. The black man, Mr. Edwards, didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, his calm demeanor still unwavering. "The law is supposed to serve justice, Judge," he said slowly, making sure his words landed. "But the law is not infallible. It's shaped by the people who enforce it, people like you, who decide what's fair and what's just. But what happens when the law fails? What happens when the system isn't fair?" Judge Richardson felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The man's words were cutting through the armor he had built over the years. Every point Mr. Edwards made felt like a personal challenge, one that threatened not just his authority, but his entire identity as a judge. "I've spent my whole career in this seat, Mr. Edwards," the judge replied, his voice shaky now. "I've made countless decisions. I've upheld the law, and I've delivered justice, even when it was hard." He paused, his gaze fixed on the gavel in front of him, as though trying to convince himself of the truth of his words. "I've always done what I believed was right. And what if what you believed was right was wrong?" Mr. Edwards asked, his tone soft but piercing. "What if, in all those years, you missed something? Something bigger than the case in front of you?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Judge Richardson couldn't respond. He thought about all the cases he had ruled over, the lives he had shaped with a single decision. He had believed he was fair, that he was doing his duty. But now, looking at Mr. Edwards, he wasn't so sure. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the soft shuffle of papers on the judge's desk. The courtroom was eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The weight of the moment seemed to stretch on forever. The judge had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. He had spent so many years hiding behind his gavel, behind the law, but now, there was no escaping the truth. He looked up at Mr. Edwards, who stood in front of him with a quiet strength. It was almost as if the man had already won, not with force, but with the truth. And that truth was something the judge couldn't ignore any longer. "You're asking me to admit that I've been wrong," Judge Richardson said, his voice trembling slightly. "You're asking me to question everything I've built my life around. I'm asking you to see what's in front of you, Judge," Mr. Edwards said, his voice steady and filled with quiet power. "I'm asking you to see the people in your courtroom as human beings, not just cases to be decided." The judge's mind was spinning. He had always believed in the purity of the law, in the idea that justice could be served by following the rules. But now, Standing in front of him was a man who had seen the cracks in the system. A man who had fought for justice from within the very system that the judge had spent his life defending. The room was silent for a long moment. The judge's hand hovered over the gavel, but he didn't strike it. His fingers tightened around the handle, his mind racing. The decision before him wasn't just about the case, it was about his entire view of the world, his entire career. Mr. Edwards took a step back, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "You don't have to make this decision right now," he said, his voice calm. "But I ask you to think about it. Think about what justice really means." Judge Richardson closed his eyes for a moment, his mind flooded with memories of the decisions he had made, the people he had sentenced, the lives he had changed. Had he been fair? Had he truly served justice? Or had he been a part of a broken system, blindly enforcing rules that weren't meant for everyone? The weight of that question pressed down on him like an anchor. He could no longer ignore the truth. He wasn't sure what the right answer was, but he knew that he couldn't keep hiding behind the law. Not anymore. Finally, the judge opened his eyes and met Mr. Edwards' gaze. "I'm listening," he said quietly. "And I will think about what you've said. I'll think about it long and hard." The courtroom was still, and the moment felt like a turning point. The judge wasn't sure where this would lead, but he knew one thing for certain: his life, his career, and his understanding of justice would never be the same again. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy stillness. Judge Richardson spent hours in his chambers, reflecting on the conversation with Mr. Edwards. The weight of his thoughts felt unbearable at times. The doubts that had been planted in his mind had only grown stronger, and now he faced a truth that he could no longer ignore. The justice he had always believed in, justice served by the letter of the law, was not enough. It was incomplete, and perhaps, it was broken. Every time he picked up a case file, he felt a pang of guilt. How many people had he sentenced without truly understanding them? How many lives had been shaped by his rulings, only for him to realize now that he hadn't seen the full picture? He had always assumed that the law was a perfect system, that if he followed its rules, he was doing right. But in reality, it wasn't the law that had been flawed, it was his understanding of it. The courtroom once felt like his domain, his place of control, where he held the power to decide the fate of those who came before him. But now, it felt like a prison. He was confined by the very ideals he had clung to for so long. It wasn't just Mr. Edwards' words that haunted him, it was the realization that he had been blind to the humanity of the people who came through his doors. One morning, a week after the trial, Judge Richardson found himself standing at the bench once more. The courtroom was nearly empty, save for a few staff members. He looked at the empty chair where Mr. Edwards had stood, his mind replaying their conversation. It felt as though the man's words had unlocked something inside him, something he had buried for years. He had always believed that being a good judge meant being detached, impartial, a cold observer of the law. But now, he realized, it meant something more. It meant seeing people for who they truly were, understanding their stories, their struggles, and their humanity. The courtroom doors opened, and a familiar figure walked in, Mr. Edwards, his expression unchanged, though the weight of the past week seemed to hang around him as well. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that the judge would eventually have to make a decision, one that would affect not just the case at hand, but the future of the system itself. Judge Richardson looked up from the desk, his eyes meeting Mr. Edwards' gaze. "I've thought about what you said," the judge began, his voice steady but filled with an emotional depth he hadn't realized he was capable of. "And you were right. I've been blind to so many things. I've followed the law without questioning whether it was really serving justice. I've passed judgment without truly seeing the people who came before me." Mr. Edwards' face softened, his eyes reflecting both the exhaustion and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the judge had taken the time to reflect, to see beyond the surface. "It's not too late to change, Judge," he said softly. "It's never too late to learn and grow. All that matters now is what you do next." The judge nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the gavel in front of him. He had always believed that the gavel was a symbol of his power, but now, it felt like a reminder of how easily power could be misused. He lifted it slowly, turning it over in his hands as he thought about the decisions he had made in the past. The people he had sentenced, the cases he had handled, how many of them had been shaped by biases he hadn't even realized he carried? How many lives had he affected without truly seeing the people behind the cases? "I can't change the past," Judge Richardson said, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. "But I can change how I move forward. I can listen more. I can understand more. And I can make sure that justice doesn't just mean applying the law, it means seeing the people I'm serving and treating them with the respect and humanity they deserve." Mr. Edwards nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "That's all anyone can ask for. We can all change, Judge. But it starts with accepting that we're not perfect, that we're not infallible." Judge Richardson took a deep breath, setting the gavel down on his desk. This was a moment of profound transformation for him, a moment that would define his legacy, not as a judge, but as a human being who understood the true meaning of justice. He stood up slowly, his hands steady now, and looked at Mr. Edwards. "I'm going to reconsider the verdict in your case. And moving forward, I promise that I will see every person who steps into this courtroom as more than just a case. I will see them for who they truly are." For the first time in his career, Judge Richardson felt a sense of peace. The burden of his past decisions wasn't gone, but it no longer held the same weight. The path ahead wasn't clear, and it wasn't going to be easy. But he had taken the first step toward real justice. A justice that wasn't about power or control, but about understanding, compassion, and fairness. The judge turned to the file in front of him, a renewed sense of purpose guiding his actions. As he made the necessary changes to the case, he knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more moments of doubt, more decisions that would test his resolve. But now, he was ready to face them, not as a man afraid of change, but as a man determined to make the system truly serve those it was meant to protect.